So, welcome to this session that we're going to do on how tutoring strategies actually look when they're applied in the learning center environment. And so, hopefully, from this, Tanner and I discussing, how these things actually look in practice, you'll gain some insights into what you can expect when you start tutoring in a learning center. So, Tanner, introduce yourself, what your major is, what your role is in the Learning Center, all that good stuff.
So I stated my name is Tanner. I'm a chemistry tutor here in the Learning Center, and I'm a biochemistry major in my last year. This is going to be I'm currently in my fifth semester of tutoring here. And I've been tutoring here for a while. I've done extra trainings. So I'm actually right now an advanced tutor, and I've helped actually train other tutors and develop trainings that you'll be attending as well during the semester.
And what's your biochem? What's your career goal?
I'm hoping to go to pharmacy school. So
Okay.
as we're filming this, I've already done my applications, and I'm just waiting to hear back for interviews at this point.
Now,
That's my end goal.
the reason why I asked that is because a lot of people, when they think about like what career they want to have, and when they take on this job, they really think that it's focused on the subject, but there's a lot of like places out in the workforce and a lot of professional schools and master's programs, doctorate programs that will ask you more leadership and communication questions than they will about like whatever your particular major was or your pathway
Mm-hmm.
was, like when you're going through the process of getting into those schools. So, you know, I hope and that's to say that with these new tutors, I hope that they have like an intention and a passion behind wanting to take on this job.
Well, and in talking to professionals too, looking at this is you don't have to want to be a teacher of your subject to be a tutor. It's taking like understanding material or taking very complex topics. For example, like for me in chemistry, like a lot of people don't like chemistry or science in general. So it's figuring out ways to take something that's hard to make and communicate it in a way that makes sense. You can develop good communication skills and, like Will already said, leadership skills, are very invaluable to professional and graduate programs after you get your bachelor's degree.
So let's get into this slide deck. I want to show the whole desktop. That's the easiest, right? So that means
Mm-hmm.
what? Like jump between screens. Okay, so this is probably what you've already gone through, and it's very general in its approach because we cover like around 12 different subject areas. And so this is hopefully going to give you more of a practical view, and then we hope in the future to make videos that are very specific and catered to specific subjects. So let's go through here. So first thing we're stumbling upon is just the overview of what these strategies actually are. And these were kind of based on like a meta-analysis of learning techniques done by John Domlosky. And in there, it basically argued for, distributed practice, which we're calling study methods, and mental retrieval as the most effective ways to learn. They had the highest utility with those two. Then close behind was critical thinking. And with critical thinking, they were proponents of elaborative interrogation, asking student questions, like being comfortable with questions as a student, or self-explanation, which is explaining things to yourself as a student. And so we kind of compile, and interleaving, which is working with multiple components and concepts to understand the larger concepts. And so we kind of compile all three of those into critical thinking. And then active learning is from a different study. I cannot remember who the author was at the moment, but this is kind of an overview of the strategies that are used in the tutoring environment. So, Tanner, when you, as a chemistry tutor, when you come up against a student that needs active learning, how does that look for you? What do you?
When I see a student that needs active learning, the first thing is I recognize that if you ask a question that should be, from your experience, a general knowledge question of the subject. So talking about, for those of you taking chemistry, like how many molecules are in a mole? And that's supposed to be Avogadro's number. And that's something that is usually taught very early. So if they can't answer a question like that from memory, then that seems to be an indicator of they haven't gone to lecture, haven't read their book.
Well, they've gone. It just hasn't. It hasn't. Well, I would say that for lecture, they could have gone to lecture, but
they haven't studied it.
Yeah, they really haven't really looked at it a second time, or and I would definitely say most of the time with active learning situations, I would say like 98% of the time, that means they haven't like read or studied further.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so with that, it's usually something like that. Or recently, I've seen quite a few students that just come in and will completely say, I haven't gone to lecture in 2 weeks, so I don't know what's going on. So students will be upfront about it. They don't really try and hide that from us as much. So it's kind of a split. Most of them will definitely be like, if you ask a question or like a critical thinking question, like why should this work or something, and they don't know a good reasoning for it, or they're struggling to answer a question.
Right.
Then it could be, well, asking, have you read the book or have you gone to lecture? And then associating from there. So if they haven't done any of that, they read the book kind of thing. Or maybe they've gone to lecture and they took notes, but they haven't looked over their notes kind of thing. So
right. I'm trying to find the let's see. So like one interesting thing with the primary study that we use to look at active learning is that this is a graph from the study, and it has to do with the physics course. And what it's looking at is determining active learning as new methods. And it could be anything as simple as like call and response, like call and response is like a concept in jazz, but it can be just simply like as a student is being exposed to this material, like they're reading something or they're watching a video, asking them questions about what they're getting or what they're writing down, or making suggestions what to focus on, just getting them engaged in answering questions and kind of reiterating what they're getting. And so you can see with the breakdown of the graph, the white bar is, a lot. Students retain a larger percentage of the concepts after having an active learning session as opposed to like traditional lecture or even preparing before the class. And there's like we'll look at the density chart in a bit, but there's different levels of active learning, like in terms of the amount of engagement you can provide students. All right, now this thing doesn't want to move forward. There we go. So this is talking about when all else fails in tutoring, typically a tutor relies on the mini lecture. Can you talk about first, because there's obviously times where maybe you've used mini lecturing, but can you talk about first, like what are the pitfalls of doing that?
In my experience, there's actually a couple pitfalls that I've had. Depending on what subject you're coming in with, I'm just going to take, for example, like physics, math, and chemistry, which tend to be the most heavily picked or heavily attended. If you start mini lecturing to only 1 or 2 students, you're going to hone your attention only on them and not be able to help anyone else. So that's one pitfall, so you get your attention focused. Another is they could just be staring at you and not trying to interact with the actual material. They're just treating it like lecture again, where just give me everything. I'm going to just take down notes and that's it.
Yeah, I think the intentions are good. Like when students are in class or when they're hearing a tutor lecture them, like the intentions are like, I'm hoping that everything that's being said is somehow coming through to me. But like
Mm-hmm.
our attention spans and our level of interest, our level of curiosity about something comes into play when we don't even know it, and we could completely just be um, like super passive and not really taking in anything that's going on. And I think to your first point too, about from like the customer service perspective, when you mini lecture and you're taking time away from other students or perceived time, which we can talk about later too, um, then I've seen students and I've heard from students that just kind of walk away. Like they're just kind of like, I'm never going back to learn.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't help me. I sat there. Nobody offered to help and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
When you invest too much in mini lecturing, that can definitely happen.
Yeah.
So the goal is to have students write, speak, reflect, read, challenge their knowledge immediately, make students collaborate, and we'll talk about how like active learning is a concept that's very like dynamic. We use it in the sense of a moment. An active learning moment is basically
Mm-hmm.
when you haven't had enough exposure to the material, but like really all the other strategies that we're doing is active learning. Let's see. So we'll kind of skip this. It's just kind of reiterating with some examples, which we've already been providing. And so, like one key aspect of active learning is making sure because you don't want a mini lecture, making sure that you actually send the student to resources to grasp the material. And this is a list of just some ideas of places you can send them. You probably experienced some of these places as a student. Your job as a tutor is not to be biased on what you've used in the past because we all have different aptitudes, different educational backgrounds and experiences, but to be aware of a plethora of things that are available outside of the classroom. So, what do you normally do in active learning moments with students, like on a good day? Because we can talk about the bad days too, but like on a good day, what do you normally do to get students away to get exposure to the material?
Um, Normally my go-to, because most of the time what I've seen is homework based, um, is I'll pull out our textbooks and I'll find a section, and from there I'll do one of two things: is like say ask them like, okay, here's where you should be reading. Try reading this, and then we'll talk about it, or read this and write like a sentence or two about it. Um, or the other good one I'll do is I tend to pull up Khan Academy videos
Okay.
because I have experience in knowing that they're pretty solid for chemistry topics. Um, and I'll have them like sit there and listen to it and watch it before attempting to do their homework, and then do a practice problem with different values in a different situation to see if they understood what they learned.
To kind of have them apply what they got out of
Mm-hmm.
the video or the textbook.
Mm-hmm.
And like the reality of it is that there's going to be some students that like they just want to focus on like I'm here to do my homework, and so
Oh yeah.
they're going to feel like every little thing like this is basically like extra time, like you're making them do extra stuff
Mm-hmm.
when you know they should have done it in the first place. And I think the the hole that a lot of tutors fall in is they'll cave in and kind of mini lecture,
Mm-hmm.
not realizing that the students going to expect that from other tutors, expect that from them in the future. And what they really need to do is stick to active learning and from the beginning and just be consistent and sincere. Like consistency and sincerity go a long way. And being able to do this from the jump, and then that way you've already set the expectation for the rest of the semester.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Critical thinking. So critical thinking is comprised of these four things: self-explanation, a student asks themselves why during learning; elaborative interrogation, someone else asks a student why during learning. So this is where the role of the tutor comes in, with kind of why and how questions. And this is after the student has had enough exposure to material, like they've had some learning. And if they didn't get the learning before coming to tutoring, then you would provide a moment for them. Uh, and so elaborative interrogation is like a tutor asking, why does that happen? How, explain how that happened. And then summarization, a student explains it as if they were explaining it to a 5-year-old, or they write down like a summary of how they understand a concept. And this is kind of when we get into talking about concepts over problems. And interleaving is interleaving a few different concepts or procedures together. But like, can you talk more about like the benefit of focusing on concepts and understanding and learning as opposed to getting a problem done or even a homework assignment done?
Yeah. In the tutoring setting, if you focus more on just getting the problem done, they're going to start having this one-way track of it goes this, then this, then this. And when they get to the test or something, or like even a homework where they switch around some variables, or they ask it from a different viewpoint, or they're trying to go the reverse direction, just something like that where they switch up how they're doing it, all of a sudden they hit a roadblock. Versus if you do the concepts, again, I use chemistry as an example, but if you learn like the general chemistry concepts of how things work and why they do certain things, as you progress further, especially if this is a major course, that type of thinking of the how, the why, and the reasonings, you can start to apply to different problems. And even if they don't know the procedure of a problem,
Right.
if they know, okay, this is happening, so this should happen, they can explain what it would look like at the end. And once they're given an equation or a process, they can get the actual answer. So the big one I would actually say is, I just said, is prediction. The ability to take what they know and predict what should happen,
Right.
so that they can have an understanding of where they should go. And now if it's a problem that they have had experience with the equation, but they're twisting around what's actually happening, well, they can say, I know this, based on what they're saying, this should happen this way, so the equation should look like this.
Right.
And they can work with the process from there. And I know the way I explained it, you have the process interleaved with it very heavily,
Right.
but it's the ability to twist it, manipulate it, and work with it that's the understanding.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is students always think about like the time crunch, or like I don't want to put in extra time. But what's interesting is if they actually learn it and they actually get understanding, you're talking about how like they're able to predict. Well, that like compounds during the semester. Even though like at the beginning of chemistry, you're looking at like Avogadro's number and stuff like that, and at the end, you're looking at reactions. Like all the knowledge that you actually put in to really learn and understand at the beginning kind of compounds, and your thinking speed gets faster with the course. And so like on the back end, you actually end up putting in less time. But that's the struggle as a tutor, is you have to be able to convince a student like what actually works for them and what's actually best for them.
Right. And if I could even interject an example from my experience of, as a chemistry major, I take a lot of chemistry classes.
Right.
We have something called significant figures for estimations, which most of you have probably heard about that at some level. But you learn that in first semester chemistry. I am in my fourth year here. I still have tests that quiz you on that. And I still have tests that you use that to describe accuracy and precision of different topics.
Right.
But even though we're not getting lectured about it anymore,
it still comes up.
Yeah, and it comes up in describing the accuracy and precision of something new. So you take the thing you know of sig figs and what they mean, and you can apply it to some brand new technique. And that happens all the time. And that's not something that we generally think about as a course by course situation.
Yeah. As new tutors, y'all learned about the Socratic method and the questioning training. So critical thinking is really, it gets back to the Socratic method. And so the three main things is, ask what students already understand. And so that's a big thing too. And Chandler gave an example of that where earlier he asked a student about Avogadro's number to get a read of like, where are they in the process of understanding this chapter, this unit, this subject. And then have students spend time writing their thoughts about what they understand, what they're understanding during the process of questioning, and then also redirecting questions. So a lot of times you'll be able to seize opportunities for learning moments when students ask you a question about like a homework problem, redirecting the question back to the concept. So like they're asking like, oh, what do I do with this reagent once I move it over here? And you're asking, how does carbon react when blah, 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 blah? Do you understand how this mechanism works? Explain how it works. And that's kind of redirecting. Like, they're focused on the problem. They got a very specific line of reasoning and procedure that they're going through with a specific problem, but you're redirecting back to the larger concept. The thinking that Tanner was talking about that's necessary to make predictions on exams.
Yeah, and I would, in my experience, I would definitely say make sure to emphasize the redirection part. And Will, you kind of alluded to it too, is just be like strong about it and to establish that expectation of like the students interacting with tutors early on.
Right.
You can get tutors that will, or not tutors, sorry, students that will continually just try to come back to their own question and they'll try to dodge that concept question.
Yeah.
So really try to emphasize that early on so they can know like that's what's more effective and what we're trying to go for.
Right. Yeah. And like sticking to these strategies at the beginning once again is critical. We're like, this is in the training, y'all were exposed to this, and it's getting very specific about how you could deploy critical thinking. We're going to get to a newer rubric that we've been working on that also addresses some of the concerns around density, because just doing the bare minimum for critical thinking is a lot different than doing something that has like a higher density and challenges students way more. But these elements are still in there: how and why questions, probing questions, group learning, identifying and explaining a mistake, writing possible test questions, wait time. Wait time is basically not answering before a student has an opportunity to think and answer, because that takes time. Cognition, having to think takes time. Now we're on the mental retrieval, and this is kind of across hundreds of studies. This is what really makes or breaks academic performance, especially when it comes to testing. And so a lot of we used to use the terminology practice testing. We backed away from that and went to mental retrieval because practice testing gave tutors the kind of misconception that they had to give a student literally a full practice test or several problems. And it's not that at all. It's just having them recall their understanding from memory without looking at the book, without asking questions, and constantly drilling them on that to give them practice. So there's a lot of ways that you can do that. This was a study that we did in the Learning Center with mock exams around like kind of what happens when students visit tutoring frequently and did more on the mock exams. Like, were they getting practice testing before taking these mock exams? And then, so like, here's some strategies that could be used. Like, Tanner, what do you do with this? What do you see with this?
A lot, like the flashcards I try to use a lot just because of the nature of some of the chemistry courses. lots of vocab and stuff, like and reactions and things that you need to know.
Right.
And with flashcards, there are other studies that really show like they're a very effective form of mental retrieval. But with that, and we'll talk about this more in the trainings and as you learn the different tutoring strategies. But there's an effective way and an ineffective way to use flashcards, so it's making sure you show them that as well. I will also use, it's not directly listed here, but I use Kahoot a lot, which is an online quiz making platform, and it's really appealing because you can use different types of quiz questions,
Right.
whether it's like multiple choice or like ordering, so you can really make them think in different ways. And it's very energetic and colorful, so they can get into it like it's a game. It's not just like a test. And then, of course, putting problems on a whiteboard and come up and solve it. Or one newer one that I've done is, how would you solve it? Don't actually solve it, just discuss the steps to do it. And the last one, and this is really effective with people who come continuously and you can develop a rapport with, is start working with how would the instructor form a question out of this information. So kind of thinking about like how could you use this information to make a test or like a question, and then how would you answer that question from there.
I think that
I realize I overlapped with critical thinking a bit, but
yeah. But what I see a lot, well, there is like some overlap, right? Because like, when you look at the Feynman notes, when you look at paraphrasing text aloud, like it is right in line with critical thinking. The only difference is with critical thinking, you can actually look at the PowerPoint slide or look at the book, or you know what I mean? Like it's fresh in your mind. And with practice testing, is having students retrieve that from memory as if they were taking a test. One thing that I see that tutors make a mistake of, and we'll talk about that when we get into density, is that they mistake recognition questions for mental retrieval. So they mistake like asking, like, what is this thing? The student giving the definition, when mental retrieval is more about like, if you were on a test, could you make a choice, a judgment, a decision about what to do with a certain type of problem, with a certain challenge? I think a lot of times tutors will rely too often on like recognition questions, which basically get back down to active learning, really mental retrieval at all. So then we have study methods, and this is going to like kind of like study skills, study habits. I think the number one habit the tutors need to break with this strategy, and it's just having a conversation with students. But the number one thing that break is like, I don't know, how do I put it? Like only sharing like what they did as a student. So like if Tanner used flashcards and that's what he did to get an A in the class, he shouldn't limit students to thinking that flashcards work for everybody in every situation for every class. He should, as a tutor, understand and learn from resources that support that, learn from training that we provide about other study methods. Like talk to students about what they do, like successful students. Talk to successful classmates that you have about what they do and how it how it differs from what you do. We have distributed practice goes into study methods. So breaking up studying, not procrastinating. Like there's hundreds of studies on this too, that you're just more effective in learning that way. And so talking to students about how to overcome procrastination, constantly encouraging them, constantly challenging them. Like when they haven't been in and they come in like after 2 weeks and you're like, hey, I know the work hasn't stopped. Like, why have you stopped coming in? Challenging them on that.
Hmm.
But let's kind of get into the density part of it. Uh, let's see how big I can make this.
Can you get rid of that toolbar at the top?
What's the key for that? F11?
Well,
Is that
just
F11?
use that.
What's that?
Can't you use this arrow right there?
Where are you at?
Top right corner-ish. Oh, what the heck, it moved.
Oh, this thing. No, not that thing. What thing?
That little caret arrow.
Tell me when I'm getting close.
Down.
Oh, this.
Right. Right.
Oh, that one.
That, yeah.
There we go.
There it is.
So this rubric is talking about the density of all these different strategies that we just talked about. And we're still adding to this, but a lot of tutors have chimed in. And I have. And Tony Lozanko, our assistant support specialist. He's academic support specialist. He's chimed in on this too. And so, like, low density in terms of active learning is having a student read a book, having a student read PowerPoint, having a student read on the web, having a student watch video, and then tutor mini lectures and ask questions. So that's like super low density. That's active. It would be regarded as active learning, but it's probably not the most effective pathway to active learning. So moderate would be have a student discuss the topic with the tutor or group and analyze what was read or watched, like after having been exposed to material. Having a student watch a video on the web and take notes while watching. Having a student read a textbook and take notes. Having a student discuss the topic with a tutor or group. And then high density would be completing a project based on the content, like checkpoint quizzes, like instead of waiting until after a student finishes, kind of snapping that process and asking them questions, having a conversation, and then yeah, that's kind of like, what do you think, Tanner? There's always things that can be added to this in progress, but
I mean, these are some of the more applicable and direct ones that can be used without getting too specific to each subject. There's already a lot listed here.
What's like in your time as a tutor, what is like the peak of like high density active learning that you've done, and what's like your like low point with active learning, and how did those play out?
The low point has been just taking a textbook and just setting it in front of them, having them read it, or like say go find the have them pull up the PowerPoint and say look over that. I'll be back in a couple of minutes. And not give them a task to do with it, so they just read and that's it. That was bad. That was a low because, especially, well, you'd have some students that would either just not read the book, or they would read the book but not interact with it, which is a different thing we've talked about of interacting with your text. Or if it's like an online video, they'll just get distracted and they won't actually read it because there's no accountability for them to finish it.
Right.
A high has been actually one that's listed here is checkpoint quizzes while reading and after reading, especially for bigger concepts, or if they're trying to learn more material in a single period. Like they do a good chunk, or if they read a lot more, going back, okay, what was this section about? Explain it, and like, what does this mean?
Right.
Like, how would I use this? And like, if I haven't been able to meet them at every checkpoint, going back and asking about each section to make sure they understood what they were talking about. And if not, then, okay, like read this section again, and either this time write a note about it, and I'll ask you a question, or if I have the time, read it out loud to me and tell me where you think the critical information is.
Right. So let's look at critical thinking, low density. I'll just give one example because y'all can read on the screen. Asking guiding questions, and so I see a lot of tutors do this where, like, let's say there's a student here learning algebra, and there is solving for a single variable, but it has some fractions in there, it has some exponents in there, and the tutor's like, what's the first step? And the student might say, doing what's in the parentheses. And then the tutor might say, okay. So the student does that, and then the student gets stuck again, and the tutor says, okay, well, like when you look at PIMDAS, like what would the next step be? And so like through the course of this one problem, there's been like 17 guiding questions.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the end of the problem, what happens and what misinforms the tutor and the student's like, oh yeah, like I get that. Like I understand how to do that problem. But then the next problem you start to see, it takes 17 questions or it takes 12 questions, like, and they really haven't gained like how to actually think about and approach the problem. They haven't really reviewed like their deficiencies and understanding what PEMDAS is. So having them map it out, having them write about it, that would have been good. Because it's concepts over problems once again. Medium density is, having them discuss it with students, having them annotate, take notes. And that's getting back to the concept as opposed to the problem. And then high density would be, interleaving the tutor asking questions that gets the student to interleave. Having a student make a mind map connecting all the concepts learned with reference. So what's a high and low here, Tanner, for you?
The low here is kind of the guiding questions of just why or how would you do this or why would you do this? Like, what's the next step? Think about this, like those kind of things. And the high would be the interleaving of something for like biochemistry. Okay, you did this step and you got this answer. What does that mean for the system as a whole, or what does that mean in terms of equilibrium, or explain like what does this mean in the other concept that you had to make an assumption to get here.
Right.
So what is that assumption? Why did you make it, and how does that apply to something else?
Right.
And again, that gets easier the more material that they've covered too. So.
Right. And I like what I love about critical thinking is that you can really coach the student on like where to find information. So like in asking them these questions and having these conversations, it's kind of like, hey, it's in the book, or the Sylvan book, or the Fox book, or whatever book it is. And then study methods is kind of like going from just mentioning something that you do personally to mentioning and making referrals to support net about like other study options, and then all the way to actually having them start like a change in study methods or start applying a change in study habits in the session. So if you're suggesting flashcards, like having them if you're suggesting block scheduling, having them make a block schedule in the session. Because we all know that like when students like leave a session, it's not like they can't just spend like a few more minutes to do something like this, or it's not like sometimes students like in this learning environment, what's really cool about it is sometimes students will come and they just have some Starbucks and they're like, I'm used to being here. I'm here most of the time. So So we know that students have the time to do things like what they would perceive as extra stuff. It's just encouraging them and being persistent and consistent about asking it and requesting it and giving advice and saying like, once again, you want to do well in this course, like I told you before, you got to start blocking studying off on your schedule. You got to start putting in time at night. And if you're consistent about having this conversation with the student, then eventually you can get them to get to that level and actually apply it in the session. And then mental retrieval, the one that we've been saying is the most effective. Low density would be something like explain a concept from memory, verbally, without looking at notes or textbook. And then medium density would be having them write those things, having them visualize those things. And then high density would be, having them write like complete notes, having them, you can come in, having them write, like draw out like a complete body, like interleaving all the concepts, how they might connect, how they might not. And like, what's the high and low for you right here, Tanner?
The low is what's kind of written there is mental retrieval is like, even just like what questions, like what is this, or honestly more of that, like just recognitions. Like the low is just, what is this? So they're not really applying anything. High density has been taking tests, but with those tests, it's been something of more, for me at least, is questions that will pull parts of information from different topics that you have to use to explain your final answer. So if it's something like an individual question on a titration question, and then tying it into how does the equilibrium affect it, how does temperature affect it, how does this, and explain Le Chatelier's principle, and making sure they can explain multiple different things and how they would apply it in the grand scheme
Right.
to that one problem.
And how do you, like, I mean, this is probably the most difficult thing, right? But it's like, it's funny because mental retrieval is the most beneficial thing.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also the most difficult to persuade students to do, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, you'll have students come in that like, oh, they want the practice exam. So the students will want practice exams, but they want them to get answers to see what's going to be on the test.
Right.
They don't want
to practice.
Right. They're not looking at it as like, here's another thing to see what I do or don't know in the study. So it's if they come in for a practice test, tell them, okay, what did you miss? And like, okay, go look back. And even though this kind of goes through the walking through, but to get the habit of walk through your test, see what did you miss. Having them explain their answers without the notes of like, you redo the entire problem on a whiteboard with no notes and try it again kind of thing. And like have them think about the answers, and every time they do a step, kind of bring the critical thinking in of why did you do that step? What principle tells you can do that? What assumption allows you to do that, or something along those lines.
And I think a common thread with all these so far is because we're at the end here, has been like start from the beginning, like start implementing these strategies properly from the beginning. Stay consistent. Do it with sincerity. Explain why you're having students do certain things and be consistent about it. And then you won't really have a lot of resistance, or you won't have to like clean up after yourself like mid-semester. You're like, I have all these students. They're coming here every day. I'm helping them. It seems like they understand, but then they're failing the exams.
Right. Yeah, and then the other resistance I would just say is them, as Will mentioned earlier, just wanting answers. So they're wanting to see the test and get the answers, or they're wanting to know what's the answer to this problem, how do I do this problem. They're not wanting to kind of take that next step and think about the problem itself. So, and especially as it's later on, we'll see students that are, if it's their first time cramming to get information in for that final. So that's where outreaches are important too. Try to get more students coming in early and developing those habits of really thinking about their material and trying to pull back stuff from last semester or last month, last semester, 2 semesters ago, whatever it is.
And your point is exactly right about the answer thing. And one thing we have to remember is, like, a lot of these students are not physics majors, or not chemistry majors, or not accounting majors. Like, they want to do other stuff, and this is a class that they have to take in order to do what they want to do. And so I think sometimes they want to they're so worried about, like this isn't my thing. I want to get a good grade. And so they're so focused on what is the answer, because I'm not getting this, that you need to figure out ways to persuade them. And consistency is one of those ways to step back, understand the concept, really learn it, get them invested in it, get them interested in it, so that it makes it easier on them on the back end. All right, Tanner, hopefully we could do more of these. Like, we could come back through like this density rubric and get really specific about chemistry concepts, and with other subject areas do this with the density rubric and get really specific about that area. But I really like this stuff. It was good.
Yeah.
All right, I'll see you later.
Yep, see you like in 5 minutes.
I know. All right.